So I was faced with a data problem, right, because I needed reserve bank data, but there was no current API for me to work with. And on the South African Reserve Bank website, there is this online form that you can fill out. Cool. Hope that doesn't count towards my time. Okay, so as I was saying, I needed data. There was no API present for me to use. So there's this online form that you can see over here that you can fill out. But it's quite cumbersome, slow, and considering there are over 4,000 unique economic indicator and time series combinations, the only real choice is to automate this process. So I'm just going to briefly speak about some of the tools that I use. So first, there's Docker. Docker you can think about as being very similar to a virtual machine in a way, but apparently it's got some computational efficiencies there. And I use a Windows machine, so I use Docker Toolbox, and that took care of most of the setup for me. Then there's RSelenium, which is actually part of the ROpenSci project. And RSelenium allows you to interact with the Selenium server from R. And what Selenium is just a piece of software that's used to automate a browser to do repetitive things, like scraping in our case. And then finally, there's TypeVNC, and I just use that to actually peek inside my virtual environment so I could see my Chrome browser and actually figure out what it was actually doing. So here's just a broad overview of what I did. So from R, you create, now fortunately you can't see with the light, but there's a dotted line around here, which is to distinguish between your virtual Docker environment and your laptop or your host environment. But essentially what you do is that from R, you create a connection object which will connect to the Selenium server, which is running in the container. So in my case, I picked Chrome as my browser. And all I did is that from this connection object, I would say, navigate here, click on this, open, close, basically anything that you can do as a user when you just browse the web. And once I kind of figured out the steps that I needed to use, this would fill out that form that I showed earlier, and then it would download the CSVs. One slight complication is that this virtual environment is viewed separately from your computer that you're working on. So even if you start Docker on your laptop, you actually need to make sure that when you set it up, you actually map the volumes such that it transports those files from this virtual environment to your machine. Otherwise, you won't be able to access those CSVs. So here's just a quick overview of how you can set some browser preferences. So I'm not going to go over all of this, but I just want to point out two important ones. One is the prompt for download. Make sure to set that to false. So that means that when you hit a prompt saying, do you want to save as, it just always clicks accept, right? And the second option is just to set within your virtual environment where you're actually sending your CSVs that you're downloading. That's important to keep track of when you're mapping the volumes, which is what I spoke about a little earlier. Right, so it's quite easy to create the connection object. You use the remote driver function within RSelenium. You punch in the IP of the virtual machine you're working with, and you just remember to pass in the settings that you created earlier. And the syntax is quite easy, so $open just means open up Chrome, and $navigate just means, hey, go to that website. So here's just an example of what it could look like. So you can see I'm using TypeVNC over here to see what's happening within my virtual environment. Here's my Docker terminal on the right. And you can see here that through Chrome, I've actually navigated to the website that I want to scrape. As I was saying, there are a multitude of commands that you can use. Here are just a couple examples of them. The find element one, which is the very top one, will probably be the most important one. And you use that command to actually kind of narrow down and say, okay, find this button or find this text box. Then once you've actually found that element, you could say, populate it with this text or click on it, etc. But as you can see, you can basically do anything that you can do as a user when you browse at home. The beauty of this is that it works really well to do parallel. So all that you're doing when you, let's say, create a 4-thread environment, it would just create 4 connection objects. So when you're peeking into your virtual environment, look here, you have 4 Chrome browser sessions running simultaneously. And this greatly does increase the speed at which you want to automate these sort of processes. All right, so just to wrap things up, RSelenium is really great when you want to scrape or gather data from a dynamic object like the reserve bank form that I mentioned earlier. I tried to use RVest, but it didn't work out because whenever I tried to extract data, I would just get some JavaScript back because that dynamic object hadn't been generated yet. So really for me, the only option that I could see was to actually use RSelenium and Docker together. Although I do advocate RVest for very simple cases where you just need to scrape a simple HTML file, let's say of sports scores or something, from a web page. Docker's cool because it helps manage your environment and ensure reproducibility. And then just a couple of issues. So memory was a little bit of an issue. I'm not sure if it's because I picked Chrome as my browser, because maybe if I picked Phantom.js or something else, it might be a little better, but to make sure that I didn't use up all my RAM. And also when setting up the Docker, I struggled to have a server that was running VNC so I could look at it with the mapping of the folders that I was talking about earlier. But I'm pretty sure someone who knows Docker more than me, which isn't that difficult, could probably sort that out quite easily. And with that, that's the end of my talk. You should definitely check it out. It's a cool addition to your tool set. And yeah, go play around with it. Thanks.